Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be covering something of a controversial topic, looking at climate change and Pascal's wager. Now, there are a range of debates around questions of climate change. Is it happening? Are humans causing it? Should we focus on adaptation or mitigation? And if we're focusing on mitigation, how should we best mitigate it? One argument in favor of action on climate change, as opposed to non-action on climate change, attempts to show that even if it were the case that human-caused climate change were very unlikely, policymakers should still act on it. This tries to kind of take the wind out of the epistemic argument against it, of saying, you know what, even if we had very little evidence for this, the consequences are so drastic that we would want to take action on it. And by the way, we have a lot of evidence for it, but even if we didn't, we would still want to act on it. In this video, I am not going to look at the full evidence for or against claims of climate change in general, human-caused climate change, or particular arguments for certain policies addressing it. Rather, I'm going to look at this very specific argument, which claims that even if we didn't have any evidence for climate change, we should still address it and see if that argument holds water. I have a previous video on Pascal's wager, which I encourage you to check out, but I'm going to give a brief explanation of the argument here and some of the reasons that it fails. So Pascal's wager is an argument for the existence of God. Basically, it claims that even if there's a very small but finite chance that God exists, you should believe, as if you're right, you'll get infinite happiness if you believe, and if an infinite suffering if God exists and you don't believe. However, if you're wrong and God doesn't exist, you'll only get finite suffering for believing and finite good for doubting. No matter how small the chance of God existing, it is better to believe than not, because of that infinite good you can get from believing and the infinite suffering that you could get from not believing. Now, the argument for human-caused climate change in this tradition goes as follows, or at least for action on human-caused climate change. Even if there was a very small chance of climate change being something we caused and could mitigate, the consequences of doing nothing are effectively infinite, if that is the case. Arguably, potentially, the destruction of the human race and our planet, and perhaps all living things in the entire universe. And even if you grant that taking action on climate change may hurt our other priorities, like economic growth, these aren't existential threats. They are finite. They're like the finite amount of suffering that you would get if you believed in God and God didn't exist. Because they're finite, they can't compare to the really existential and infinite threat of destroying every living thing that's ever existed. As with God, no matter how small the probability, if the consequences are infinite suffering, you are always better acting. So the argument here is basically that because the harm that could be done from climate change is so great, we don't need to talk about the probability of it. Because even if the probability were very small, we would still want to take action on it, because we have an infinity in our matrix. There's a possibility that we could wipe out the entire human race or all living things that we know of. However, as I've argued in other videos, there are several deep issues with Pascal's wager, some of which don't really apply here, such as worries about doxastic voluntarism, but some of which do. One main problem is that there are not just two options. There are many possible gods that might exist, especially if we're taking a very, very small but finite probability as the baseline, including a contrarian god that would provide infinite punishment for believers and infinite pleasure for non-believers. If your only argument is that God has a very small finite probability, then so does such a contrarian god. And the infinities will cancel each other out, and there's no reason to believe as opposed to not believe. Additionally, it doesn't address the issue of which god to believe in, as many gods promise infinite happiness for believing them and infinite suffering for not. And so, if you're worried about just figuring out what god's going to get you the most happiness, if they're all promising infinity, it's a wash, and there's no reason to believe in one over another. If there's the possibility of a contrarian god in there, there's no reason to believe at all. And if we have our solid finite probabilities of saying that, you know what, generally we would consider believing to be bad if it's false and not believing to be good if it's true, then there's a good argument against it. At the very least, Pascal's wager becomes unconvincing, if not an outright argument for doubting God's existence. Now, unfortunately for climate change activists, these issues are present in the climate change argument as well. The argument only holds if there is only one existential threat to humanity, climate change. If there is the threat of, say, global nuclear war, a global pandemic, a supervolcano under Wyoming erupting, a meteor hitting the Earth, etc., then there is not only one infinity on the board, and these existential threats may cancel each other out. If, for example, you believe that the only way that NATO is able to prevent a nuclear war is to maintain sufficient economic growth in the countries that make up NATO for the taxes from that growth to fund the military to maintain mutually assured destruction, as well as diplomatic and aid programs to foster better relations with other countries that have nuclear missiles. Reducing the growth in favor of combating climate change may be enough to set off this other existential threat, basically saying if we do so much as to combat climate change and do as much as we would need to actually mitigate climate change, then we may be in danger of not spending enough on diplomacy, aid, and the military to prevent a nuclear war. And if we do that, and the nuclear war happens, we're at an existential threat again that might wipe out all life in the known universe. As was Pascal's wager, even if the chance of that chain of events happening is very small, it doesn't matter, because the consequences are infinite. The same could be said of slowing growth, diminishing tax returns, leading to decreased spending on the CDC, education, and or healthcare that might lead to a pandemic, which could feasibly at least wipe out all human life. These may be unlikely, but as long as the threat is existential and there's an infinity on the board of infinite suffering or all humans being taken off the planet, it doesn't matter. If your only argument is Pascal's wager of it doesn't matter how unlikely it is, if there's an infinite existential threat on the board, we need to put all of our resources towards it. So the concern here is that just like there's the possibility of a range of different gods that could offer you great things in an afterlife or horrible punishments in an afterlife, there are a range of scenarios which could lead to everything on Earth being wiped out. And so this argument isn't sufficient to convince us that any one of those scenarios deserves more funding than the other. You need an argument about the probability. What's the likelihood of those scenarios? But that likelihood argument is exactly the thing that Pascal's wager is trying to get around. It's trying to say we don't need to talk about likelihood, even if we grant that this is very unlikely, then we still need to pay attention to it. So this brings up that concern with this argument. The point is, when there is only one option which provides infinite harm or is an existential threat, then the decision is easy, no matter how unlikely that scenario is. That's the nugget of wisdom that we get from Pascal's wager. However, the problem is that Pascal's wager inaccurately, both for the situation of gods as well as for the situation of various policies, doesn't realize that there are multiple scenarios that might lead to infinite harm or an existential threat. The probabilities must be taken into account to prioritize these policy choices because there is a possibility of infinite harm down many paths. Even if the world is warming faster than ever, the doomsday clock is also closer to midnight than it's ever been. Pascal's wager takes advantage of our willingness to admit that even positions we disagree with have a small, non-zero probability. However, if we're concerned about any unlikely claim with existential consequences, it's fallacious to ignore the fact that there are many such claims. And once you have more than one claim, you need to go back and look at the actual probabilities of how likely is this to happen to truly assess the resources you need to put forward towards it. Pascal's wager is simply a bad argument, and is no more useful in proving the need to address human-caused climate change than it is the existence of God. That does not mean that climate change is not happening, nor does it mean that there's not good evidence for the claim. Simply that this is a bad argument. If you're a scientific realist, as many people are, and believe that the scientific method is a means of gaining knowledge, the conclusions about humanity's effect on the climate are clear. Using an invalid, disproven argument like Pascal's wager makes your case seem much weaker, not stronger. These realists would be better served by attempting to defend scientific realism against the myriad of unanswered arguments from philosophical skeptics, like myself, such as the problem of induction and the problem of underdetermination, as it is contradictory to accept scientific realism, the claim that our scientific theories provide us knowledge, and deny climate change, namely the scientific theory that makes the claim that humans are causing the climate to change. If you accept that science gives us knowledge, you can't then deny some of that knowledge that you think science gives us. So, what do you think? Is Pascal's wager a valid way to argue for action on climate change? Can you accept scientific realism, deny climate change, and be logically consistent? Are arguments against human-caused climate change all fallacious propaganda, or are some versions of the philosophical skeptics' arguments against scientific realism, along the lines of the problem of underdetermination or the problem of induction? Write your answers in the comments below. I'll be curious to hear what you think. As a skeptic, I'm not really taking a position on this issue broadly, but I am taking the position that the argument of Pascal's wager as a way to prove climate change or the way to prove God is just a bad argument and doesn't succeed. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.